For more than 100 years, one name has ruled the ancient world. Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king. You've seen him fill a movie screen, top every list, and haunt every child's dinosaur drawing. For most of your life, the story was simple. The biggest, deadliest killer that ever walked the earth wore that crown. It's not true. Rex was a heavyweight, but he was not the longest, not the tallest, and quite possibly not even the deadliest predator this planet has ever built. Thousands of miles away, and millions of years before Rex drew his first breath, other hunters were already larger. One stretched longer than a city bus and prowled rivers no crocodile would dare enter. Another hunted in packs, each animal heavier than a bull elephant, tearing into prey the size of a 4-story building. A third carried jaws lined with teeth like steak knives, curved, serrated, and built for a single purpose, to slice giants apart while they were still alive. These were the true titans, the largest land predators the world has ever produced. And here is the strangest part, most of them never once laid eyes on a T-Rex. By the time the famous tyrant finally arrived, the real monsters were already long gone. Over the next half hour, you're going to meet every one of them. You'll find out who was the longest, who was the heaviest, who would have walked away if they'd ever crossed paths, and why the crown you always handed to Rex may have been stolen millions of years before he was ever born. Before we crown anyone, we have to agree on what we're actually measuring, and that turns out to be harder than it sounds. Ask a paleontologist to name the largest meat-eating dinosaur and you won't get one answer. You'll get 3, because largest can mean 3 very different things. It can mean the longest, the animal that measured the most feet from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail. It can mean the heaviest, the animal that put the most tons on the scale. Or it can mean the deadliest, the animal with the bite, the weapons, and the sheer killing power to take down anything it wanted. And the twist is this. The longest hunter was almost certainly not the heaviest. The heaviest was almost certainly not the longest. And the one with the most terrifying bite may not have topped either list. Length, weight, and lethality point to 3 different animals, which is exactly why the argument over the biggest predator has been running for over a century and shows no sign of stopping. There's another problem too. We are not looking at complete skeletons. For most of these giants, we have a skull here, a leg bone there, a fragment of jaw. Sometimes a single bone, dug out of the desert, is all that stands between science and a total mystery. From those scraps, researchers have to rebuild an entire animal and estimate how heavy it was in life. So every number you're about to hear comes with a margin of error. When scientists tell you a dinosaur weighed 9 tons, what they really mean is somewhere in that neighborhood, give or take. So keep those 3 crowns in your mind as we go, longest, heaviest, deadliest. Because by the end of this, you're going to hand out all 3, and at least one of them is going to end up on a head you never expected. Let's start with the animal you think you already know. You already have a picture of Tyrannosaurus rex in your head, everybody does. The problem is most of what people believe about him is either exaggerated, outdated, or flat wrong. So let's set the record straight, using the real bones. In the summer of 1990 in the Badlands of South Dakota, a fossil hunter named Sue Hendrickson noticed a few weathered bones sticking out of a cliff face. What she'd found turned out to be the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex ever discovered, around 90% of the skeleton, right down to the tiny bones in the inner ear. They named her Sue, and Sue rewrote the textbook. Because for the first time, scientists could measure a rex instead of guessing at one. Sue stretched about 40 feet from nose to tail. She stood roughly 12 feet tall at the hip, and she weighed somewhere around 9 tons, as much as a fully loaded cement truck. Then, years later in Saskatchewan, Canada, another specimen turned up. They called him Scotty, and Scotty was even bigger, the heaviest, most massive Tyrannosaurus ever found. If you want the upper limit of how large this animal could get, Scotty is it, but it isn't the size that makes Rex special, it's the bite. Tyrannosaurus had the strongest bite of any land animal that has ever existed before or since. We're talking a force in the neighborhood of 6 tons coming down through those jaws were enough to crush bone into powder. And that's not a figure of speech. Scientists have found fossilized dinosaur droppings full of ground-up bone fragments. Rex didn't just tear the meat off his prey, he crunched straight through the skeleton and swallowed it. No other predator on this list could do that. His teeth weren't blades. They were spikes, thick banana-sized bone crushers. So there's your first crown holder. In sheer bulk and pure destructive bite force, Tyrannosaurus rex is very hard to beat. High's the heavyweight champion. But, and this is where the story cracks open, Rex lived at the very end of the age of dinosaurs, around 66 to 68 million years ago, in North America. He was one of the last of his kind. And by the time he showed up, on the other side of the world, hunters had already grown longer than he ever would. To meet them, we have to travel south, and we have to go back in time. Argentina, the southern tip of South America, the year is 1993. A local mechanic and amateur fossil hunter named Ruben Carolini is out riding his dune buggy across the badlands of Patagonia when he spots a bone poking out of the rock. He has no idea what he's found, he just knows it's big. What Carolini had stumbled onto was a nearly complete skeleton of an animal science had never seen. And when researchers measured it, they realized they were looking at something that rivaled, and in one crucial way beat, the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex. They named it in his honor Giganotosaurus carolinii, the giant southern lizard. Here's what makes Giganotosaurus matter. It was longer than Rex. Not by a lot, but the tape measure doesn't lie. Where a big Tyrannosaurus topped out around 40 feet, Giganotosaurus stretched to roughly 42, maybe 43 feet. Its skull alone was over 5 feet long, nearly the height of a grown man, and it lived around 98 million years ago. That's 30 million years before Tyrannosaurus rex was even a whisper on the wind. Think about that. The gap in time between Giganotosaurus and T-Rex is larger than the gap between T-Rex and you. But the two animals were built for very different jobs. And you can read that job description straight off their skulls. Rex had a deep, heavy, bone-crushing head. Giganotosaurus had a long, narrow skull packed with teeth that were flatter, thinner, and edged like blades. It wasn't a bone crusher. It was a slicing machine. And the reason for that comes down to what it was hunting. Because in Giganotosaurus's world, the plant eaters were not deer-sized. They were the largest animals ever to walk the land, or the long-necked sauropods, some of them stretching 100 feet and weighing dozens of tons. You don't crush an animal like that. You can't. It's too big. Instead, you slash. You open long, deep wounds, you back off, and you let your victim bleed. Giganotosaurus wasn't built to win a wrestling match. It was built to inflict 1,000 cuts on a creature the size of a house and wait. And here's the thing about a hunter that goes after prey that enormous. Sometimes one giant isn't enough. A few years after Giganotosaurus was found, paleontologists working in the same region of Argentina uncovered something that stopped them cold. It wasn't one skeleton, it was a graveyard. Buried together in a single bone bed were the remains of at least 7, possibly more, individual predators. They belonged to a close cousin of Giganotosaurus and animal researchers named Mapusaurus. And they were all found in one place, jumbled together, adults and youngsters alike. Now, one skeleton tells you about an animal. A pile of skeletons tells you about a behavior. And the question that bone bed raised is one of the most chilling in all of paleontology. Why were so many of these giants in the same spot? Some scientists think it may simply be that many individuals died there over a long stretch of time, their bones collecting in one place. But others floated a far more disturbing possibility. That Mapusaurus hunted together, in groups. Stop and picture what that would actually mean. Mapusaurus was enormous, comparable in size to Giganotosaurus, each animal heavier than a bull elephant. The prey in that ecosystem included some of the most massive sauropods that ever lived, plant eaters pushing 100 feet long. A single predator, no matter how big, has no realistic way of bringing down a fully grown animal like that. But 7 of them, working the flanks, darting in and out, slashing and retreating in coordination? Suddenly the impossible becomes dinner. We can't prove it, that's the honest truth. The bone bed could be a pack, or it could be a coincidence written in stone. But it forces a question that gets right to the heart of what makes these animals so unsettling. What frightens you more, a single monster hunting alone, or a coordinated group of the largest land predators on Earth, closing in from every direction at once on prey the size of a building? Hold that thought. Because now we're going to cross an ocean to a continent that produced a predator whose very name means what you're already thinking. North Africa, roughly 95 to 100 million years ago. Back then, the Sahara wasn't a desert. It was a vast, green, waterlogged world of rivers and swamps, teeming with life, and ruled by a predator that carried a name straight out of a nightmare. Carcharodontosaurus. It translates almost literally to shark-toothed lizard. And the name is earned. This animal's teeth were long, curved, and edged with tiny serrations, like the blade of a steak knife scaled up to the length of your hand. They were designed to do exactly one thing, carve through flesh. Carcharodontosaurus stood shoulder to shoulder, with the largest predators on this entire list, stretching somewhere in the range of 40 to 43 feet, with a skull over 5 feet long. Some estimates put it right at the very top for length among all meat-eating dinosaurs. But Carcharodontosaurus carries a piece of history that most of its rivals don't. Because to tell you its full story, I have to tell you how we almost lost it forever. The first good remains of this animal were studied in the early 20th century by a German scientist named Ernst Stromer. He had them shipped back to Munich, where they sat in a museum, described and catalogued. Priceless windows into a lost world. And then came the Second World War. In 1944, Allied bombers struck Munich. The museum was hit. And the original fossils of Carcharodontosaurus, irreplaceable, one of a kind, were destroyed in the fire. Along with them burned the original bones of another giant we're about to meet, one you have absolutely heard of. For decades afterward, science was left working from Stromer's old drawings and notes, a portrait of a monster whose actual bones no longer existed. It wasn't until new expeditions returned to Africa decades later and pulled fresh skulls out of the sand that Carcharodontosaurus could be rebuilt at all. Think about that the next time you look at a museum skeleton. Some of these animals had to be discovered twice. And that giant that burned alongside it in Munich? That was the strangest of them all. The one that breaks every rule you thought you knew about what a predatory dinosaur is supposed to be. If this were a contest for length alone, we could stop right here. Because nothing on land, no predator that has ever been found, anywhere in any age, was longer than this animal. Spinosaurus. Where Tyrannosaurus reached about 40 feet, Spinosaurus stretched to a staggering 50 feet or more. Some estimates push it towards 60. That's longer than a school bus. On its back rose a sail of tall bones and skin that stood as high as a grown man is tall, an enormous rippling fin running down its spine. It had a long, narrow snout like a crocodile packed with cone-shaped teeth. And it lived in that same lush, watery North Africa around 95 to 100 million years ago, alongside the shark-toothed lizard we just met. But length is the least interesting thing about Spinosaurus. Because Spinosaurus did something no other giant predator did. It went into the water. And I want to be honest with you here because this is one of the great living arguments in modern science, an argument that has flipped back and forth more than once in just the last few years. It goes like this. Around a decade ago, a team led by paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim unveiled a new, more complete Spinosaurus and made a bombshell claim. This wasn't a land animal that occasionally waded, this was a swimmer. They pointed to its dense, heavy bones. The same kind you find in penguins and manatees, animals that use their weight to sink and stay submerged. They pointed to its short, powerful hind legs and its paddle-like tail. And they argued that Spinosaurus spent much of its life hunting underwater, chasing giant fish through the rivers of Africa like a crocodile the size of a bus. It was a stunning idea, and immediately other scientists pushed back hard. A rival team ran the numbers and argued that a sail-backed animal like this would have been dangerously unstable in deep water, too buoyant to dive, constantly tipping over. Their verdict? Spinosaurus wasn't a deep-diving pursuit predator at all. It was a wader, a giant that stalked the shorelines and the shallows, standing chest-deep in the water and ambushing fish with those crocodile jaws but keeping its feet planted firmly in the mud. So which was it, a submarine or a shoreline stalker? The honest answer right now is that scientists still don't fully agree, and it's still moving. Just recently, researchers announced a brand new species of Spinosaurus dug out of the rocks of Niger, adding fresh bones to a puzzle that's been debated for over a century. Every few years, someone finds something new, and the argument tips again. But here's what nobody disputes. Spinosaurus was the longest predatory dinosaur we have ever found. It ruled a world of water that no other giant on this list would touch, and it prowled rivers that no crocodile would dare to enter because Spinosaurus was the crocodile's nightmare. Now, before we hand out the crowns, I have to show you something that turns this whole story on its head, because we've spent this entire journey assuming that biggest theropod means biggest killer. And that assumption is dead wrong. The word theropod simply means a member of the group that includes all the meat-eating dinosaurs. And technically the birds alive today. But not every giant theropod was a hunter. Some of the strangest, largest members of the whole family had abandoned the predator's lifestyle entirely. And you need to meet two of them because they'll change how you think about size. The first is called Deinocheirus. For 50 years, this animal was one of the greatest mysteries in all of paleontology. because for half a century all anyone had found were its arms. And those arms were monstrous, around 8 feet long each, tipped with enormous curved claws. Scientists imagined some unimaginable horror on the other end of them. And then, finally, more complete skeletons turned up, and the truth was almost comical. Dinocheirus was a huge, humpbacked, duck-billed oddball, over 30 feet long, and it ate plants and fish. Those terrifying claws used for raking up vegetation. One of the largest theropods that ever lived was essentially a giant, shaggy, harmless weirdo. The second is the Resinosaurus. And if Dinocheirus had big claws, the Resinosaurus had the largest claws of any animal in the history of the planet. We're talking curved blades approaching 3 feet in length, longer than your arm. Look at those weapons, and your mind screams killer. But the Resinosaurus was a pot-bellied plant eater, using those absurd scythes to hook and pull down leafy branches like a prehistoric sloth built on the scale of a giraffe. So here's the lesson buried in these two oddballs. Being enormous and even being armed to the teeth did not automatically make a theropod a predator. Size and menace are not the same thing. And that matters because it means when we finally crown the largest predators, we have to be careful. We're not just looking for the biggest theropods. We're looking for the biggest ones that actually hunted, which brings us at last to the reckoning. So let's do what we came here to do. Let's hand out the 3 crowns, longest, heaviest, deadliest. And let's find out once and for all whether Tyrannosaurus Rex deserves the throne you've always given him. Crown number 1, the longest. This one isn't close. The title goes decisively to Spinosaurus. At 50 feet and possibly beyond, no predatory dinosaur ever found has matched its length. The river monster of Africa wins on the tape measure, and it isn't even a contest. Crown number 2, the heaviest. And here, at last, is where Rex fights back. Because length can be deceiving. Spinosaurus was long, but it was also lean and lightly built, stretched out like a crocodile. When you talk about raw mass, real bulk on the scale, the fight comes down to 2 animals. Tyrannosaurus Rex, that barrel-chested, thick-boned tank of a predator, and Giganotosaurus, the giant from the south. Some estimates give the edge to the largest Giganotosaurus specimens. Others hand it right back to a big Rex like Scotty. And the reason we can't settle it is that we have dozens of Tyrannosaurus skeletons to study, but only a scrap or 2 of the very largest individuals of its rivals. So, the heaviest crown sits on a knife's edge, shared between the tyrant and the southern giant, and honest scientists will tell you the difference may come down to a matter of a ton, one way or the other. Or the crown number 3, the deadliest. And this is the one everyone argues about because deadly depends on what you're trying to kill. If deadly means the single most devastating bite, the ability to crush bone to end a fight in one crunch, then Tyrannosaurus Rex takes it, hands down. Nothing else on this list comes close to that bite force. But if deadly means the most efficient slaughter of the largest prey on Earth, then the Carcharodontosaurs, Giganotosaurus, Mapusaurus, Carcharodontosaurus have a serious claim with their slicing teeth and perhaps their numbers. But here's the fact that should give you chills. The reason we can't stage the ultimate showdown, Rex versus Giganotosaurus, tyrant versus southern giants, isn't just a matter of opinion. It's that they never could have met. Giganotosaurus was already extinct for around 30 million years before Tyrannosaurus Rex was born. Spinosaurus, gone. Carcharodontosaurus, gone. These titans didn't share a battlefield. They ruled different continents in different ages, separated by oceans and by tens of millions of years. The greatest predator fight in history is one that never happened and never could. So keep your crowns, but understand what they really tell you. There was no single greatest predator. There was an age of giants, and Rex was only the last of them. Which leaves the biggest question of all. Why did nature again and again on continent after continent build predators this enormous? What was the point of a meat eater the size of a bus? The answer is written in the bodies of the animals they hunted. Because a predator can only grow as large as its prey allows. And in the age of these giants, the prey was the largest the land has ever seen. Think back to that world. The long-necked sauropods, but the biggest land animals in the history of the earth were everywhere, some of them 100 feet long, weighing as much as a herd of elephants. When your dinner is that big, evolution rewards you for getting bigger too. A bigger predator can tackle bigger prey, and bigger prey can feed a bigger predator, and around it goes, each pushing the other to grow. It's an arms race written across millions of years. Bigger meals demanding bigger hunters demanding bigger weapons. There were other ingredients too. The climate back then was a hothouse. Warmer, wetter, greener than today. Lush vegetation fed enormous herds of plant eaters, and enormous herds of plant eaters fed enormous predators. The continents themselves were sprawling and open, giving these giants room to roam and hunt across vast territories. Everything about that world was scaled up. The plants, the plant eaters, the killers. And that's the real reason there wasn't just one giant predator, but a whole parade of them in Africa, in South America, in North America, each evolving separately, each solving the same problem in its own way. They were all answers to the same question the ancient world kept asking. How big can a killer get when the meal is the size of a building? But no arms race lasts forever, and the age of the giants was about to come to an end. Here's the part of the story almost nobody tells. The greatest of these predators, the shark-toothed giants, the southern titans, did not go extinct